Hello YouTube! So a little while ago I made a video called Animals Don't Matter, which was one of my more controversial videos, and I should say, before I get into this, that I haven't actually changed my mind on anything, so if you're looking for a conversion, don't get your hopes up. But I have been rethinking this. I have been thinking about my position. It was brought up to me recently in conversation, and that prompted me to rethink it, particularly in light of some of the other things I've been thinking about recently. So I, more recently, made a video on pessimism, where I expressed the view that that life pretty much sucks. That was what I talked about there. Yeah, and there's one big thing, there's one big kind of aspect of life that I didn't really talk about, and I didn't really talk about it because it's missing in my own life, I think. But it probably might make a big difference to others. So when I claim that that life is bad, you'll notice if you watch that video that I'm very uncomfortable endorsing a sort of general pessimistic conclusion. I mean, I can say that my life is bad. I can reflect on my life and I can think about how I would evaluate it relative to my standards, and then when I look at other people's lives, I can see various ways in which my life looks a lot better than theirs. But at the end of the day, I can't get inside other people's heads. And there are also significant differences between myself and other people, which might be relevant. And that's one reason why I don't want to endorse a general conclusion about everybody. Now, one big thing that I think perhaps makes a difference is human relationships, right? So it's just a sort of feature of my psychological constitution that I don't know how to talk about this without sounding like I'm just being an edgelord, right? But I don't know, maybe I am just an edgelord. But right, it also happens to be true that I'm extremely low on compassion, sympathy, empathy. I don't know why that is, but I just am. I just always have been this way. I've never really been, like, it's just never been a drive to me. It's never been a primary motivation of mine, And in that earlier video on the animals issue, this kind of comes out in the way that I choose to approach morality. Obviously, I'm an anti-realist, right? So, and I'm a pretty hardcore anti-realist. So, you can approach morality however you want. You're not necessarily making a mistake if you approach it in a different way to me. But I do present a way of approaching morality that doesn't really depend on compassion, sympathy, empathy. So I make this argument in favour of a kind of contractarian type of framework where moral rules arise from rational agents negotiating with other rational agents in order to promote their own self-interest. I mean, that's the sort of general idea. And I say, look, one thing that one benefit of this kind of approach over approaches that emphasise a more sort of emotional grounding for morality is, if you start appealing to emotional reactions, such as, for instance, sympathy for animals, well, that seems like it can sort of justify anything. The person who is sympathetic to animals and so is distressed by animal suffering, yes, that can then sort of support the construction of moral rules against particular actions we might take to animals. But then, you have people like the homophobe who is disgusted by homosexuality. They have a really strong emotional reaction against that. So, what are we then going to construct moral rules against homosexuals? So I'm being very, very brief here, obviously, right? Don't start badgering me about this in the comments. I know I'm being really brief. I'm just trying to kind of give a bit of background. Anyway, the point of all of this is, that's the sort of framework I'm taking, this kind of contractarian framework where I'm looking at it in terms of what sort of rules will promote my own self-interest. Or at least that's what I say, right? That's what I say in that video, but that's obviously a rationalization, isn't it? I mean, it's not like I've reasoned my way to the position that animals don't matter. I just don't care about animals. And then I'm constructing a rationalization that will allow me to justify that. As is the case for most moral arguments, I think. That's what that's what usually happens. People just have these sort of inclinations, right? And then they are called upon to justify them, and you can do a better or worse job of that. But I think usually the inclinations come first. I mean, ultimately, our moral attitudes are products of our psychological constitutions, and then most of us can engage in reasoning. We can provide justifications, and sometimes we do change our minds, right? Sometimes we do follow the argument, but very often the inclinations, the intuitions are prior to the argument, and that's certainly the case for my lack of concern for animals. I never cared about animals, and like, god damn it, man, I remember when I was younger, I used to like watch I would see videos of animals preying on other animals. I'd see videos of predation, and it never bothered me at all. I could watch like a deer being eaten alive by a Komodo dragon, and I mean, presumably that involves an enormous amount of suffering for the deer, and my reaction was always one of sort of interest. It was like, oh well, that's interesting, and that's not something you see every day. I would watch it with curiosity, but I never cared. I didn't care at all about the deer. There was absolutely no sort of kind of empathetic identification with the deer. There was no sense of like concern for its suffering. So anyway, that's just the way I am. So here's the thing. In general, right, I am quite low on compassion and empathy, and it's not like nothing, right? I mean, I'm moved by human suffering, but even in the case of humans, it's like I feel like it's very sort of self-interested. When I see people, if I see like a homeless person, that bothers me. But like, do I care about them, or is it that I'm kind of projecting what might happen to me in the future? I'm kind of imagining ways in which I might become homeless, and so I'm like, fuck, I don't want to live in a society where people can end up in that kind of condition. Holy shit, right? That's something that's worth opposing, right? I mean, it's like, I'm not really sure. I feel like that there's certainly a significant element of that where it's like, I just don't want to live in that kind of world where somebody can end up in that sort of position, because I might end up in that kind of position. I mean, I could totally end up homeless. Fuck, I don't want that to happen, right? So, like, yeah, even when it comes to concern for human suffering, I'm not sure how much of a role sympathy really plays in that. And we then have to, so that's sort of the kind of moral attitude, but, this manifests itself in my life in general, right? Like, I don't form relationships with people, really. So I don't form a lot of friendships. In fact, I do have some friends now, but very, very, very few, and I get on perfectly well with people, like, but so here's what happens, right? I can go out to parties, or I might, like when I'm at university, I might go out to conferences, or I'll go out to a pub or something, and I see people forming relationships. I see people forming friendships. Like, what ends up happening is that people won't just be on friendly terms, because I can be on friendly terms with people. I can sit and talk to people about my views, and in a perfectly civil way, I can do all of that. So I can be on friendly terms with people, and I can see other people doing that. But then with other people, it always goes, or it sometimes goes further, right? So they'll form some sort of deeper connection where I don't even know how to put this in like the right terms. I don't know how to describe what's going on mentally. So I'm just going to describe what happens in terms of the behaviour. But the behaviour will be things like, okay, I'm going to put this person's number in my phone, for example. I never did that. I never got close enough to anybody in my entire time at university to put their number in my phone, right? So there's an example, and I don't really know why that is. I'm not sure why that is. It's maybe I just don't have that sort of desire to form those relationships. I'm not sure. But similarly, I wonder about the sort of, even in the rare cases when I do form connections, I don't know how strong those connections are. I know somebody, for instance, who formed like such a deep connection with a boyfriend of hers that when they broke up, she was almost suicidal. Like it was just like devastating. You know, it was like the world collapsed, right? And I mean, that's kind of an extreme reaction. I can't even imagine having anything even approaching that ever happen. Like it's just, you know, I can't imagine forming that kind of deep connection to anyone. Even when like you know, my mum died, right, about a year ago, and I'm not sure how deeply it moved me emotionally. I remember after it happened, there was a lot of practical stuff to sort out. And so I was just kind of thinking about that. You know, it was like, okay, what the hell are we going to do with the house, right? And it was, and my mind was just kind of on that. And I actually did expect, at some point, I was like, I'm gonna get hit with grief. I don't think I did. I don't think that ever happened. I think I just kind of got on with stuff. And of course, I mean, I didn't want my mum to die. We had a great relationship. But I think that, again, my concerns were always just very practical. Like, okay, what do I need to do now? And there wasn't really that sort of deep grief. So, and, you know, I suppose my failure to get dates, which I've mentioned before on this channel, maybe this is just part of this, right? Like, I just have a general failure to form human relationships. Anyway, so what's the point of this? Well, in some ways, I think this is good. So I suspect, I mean, you know, I might be wrong about this. I suspect that this kind of way of approaching things, the kind of constitution I have, probably helps with respect to stuff like, you know, critical thinking about, you know, social issues, for instance. I mean, when people have like really strong emotional reactions, or they form like empathetic identification with other people, that can cloud one's judgment, and it can sometimes, you know, drive people to do really terrible things or to hold stupid positions. I mean, I suspect that the kind of empathetic identification with victims of crime will lead to stupid shit like tough on crime sort of policies, you know? I mean, I say that's stupid shit. I mean, it depends on the circumstances, but generally speaking, I think that's a really bad way of approaching the criminal justice system. You know, the focus should be on how do we reduce crime, right? I think that's pretty much all that I care about, right? I don't, you know, give a shit about like retribution and stuff like that. I don't think that's something that the government should be doing. And, you know, this is just an example of where, you know, if you identify with victims and you feel like there's some kind of cosmic imbalance that has to be, you know, somebody's done a wrong and you have to right the wrong by imposing something bad on them, that's a stupid way of thinking. And, you know, I wonder if these emotions of like compassion and empathy and so on can play a role in that. So in some ways this has benefits, but the proposal is, well, maybe this is why my life sucks, you know. Humans are social animals, right? You know, and perhaps if I formed deeper connections with other people, I would be happier. Who knows? I mean, it's something that's worth taking seriously, because a lot of people, I mean, just the fact of the matter is, right, that a lot of people say that their lives are good, and when you ask them why their lives are good, the relationships that they form with other people play, you know, that's a big part of the answer, right? And very often, you know, like material stuff, material possessions, at least for people who are kind of reflective about their lives, that plays a far less significant role, right? Like, that just doesn't matter. I mean, one of the things I pointed out in that video on pessimism was, you know, my life is so much better than the majority of people's in the world, the majority of lives in the world, in certain ways, such as, you know, all of these luxuries that I have, just in virtue of, you know, happening to be born in you know, in the place that I was born, right? Like, I kind of got lucky. Okay, so I live in a place where, you know, I have access to like loads of lovely food, and, you know, my house is warm, and etc., right? Oh, I've got clothes, right? It's great. And, you know, there's people in the world who, you know, really struggle to get material possessions, but you know, if they form, you know, strong social bonds, they're happy nevertheless, right? So the thought is, look, the reason why my life sucks, right, is because I have this kind of psychological constitution such that I just don't form deep relationships with people, or deep connections with people. I mean, that's not entirely true. I can form deep connections, but I just don't. I mean, maybe it doesn't happen that often, right? Like, I very, very rarely form friendships and so on. So I have this kind of psychological constitution that leads me to be that way, and that's why my life sucks. And that's the same reason why I don't care about animals, right? Like, I just happen to be constituted in such a way that I don't tend to empathize. I don't tend to be compassionate. I don't have like these feelings of sympathy. If I had the capacity for that, I would be happier. But it's that, right, that is driving my lack of concern for animals. If I had the capacity for compassion and sympathy, or at least I had it to a greater extent than I do, then I would be moved by animal suffering. When I see the deer being eaten alive by the Komodo dragon, I would be horrified at the intense agony that the deer is experiencing. So there's this common cause, the common cause of like the badness of my life, right, and the fact that I just don't care about animals. It's the same thing, yeah, perhaps. So this is an interesting thought, because it's like I can't, given that I recognise that my life sucks, I can't really endorse this way of being. Like I mean, I can't promote this as being like a good way to be, a good way to exist. I mean, it's not as though I can just change. I mean, I am the way I am, right? But is this something that I can promote to others? Is this something that I can endorse and say, like, hey, this is the way to be, this is a good way to be? Well, not really, because I mean, I've said, right, this kind of sucks, right? Life kind of sucks, at least for me. So I'm not endorsing this. I can't endorse this way of being, and yet this way of being is what's driving my moral attitudes. So there's this kind of sense in which I'm sort of alienated from my own positions. I mean, like, I agree with them because they're my positions, obviously, but I kind of can't promote them to others, because who would want to be this way, right? Why would you want to be like this? And it's again, like, why would you want to be the kind of person who like doesn't form friendships? And that's the reason why I don't care about animals. That's the reason why I have the moral attitudes I do there. So, in the end, I suppose it just always comes back to the fact that, David Hume, Hume is right. Hume is always right. He's always right, isn't he? If not in the details, then at least in spirit, Hume is right about everything. Which, of course, does raise some troubling questions about race. No, it doesn't. That was a joke, okay? It doesn't raise any questions. He was wrong about that. But, look, I agree with Hume when it comes to philosophy on pretty much everything. But there's one big area of difference, and that's morality. Because Hume, of course, saw sympathy as the sort of central virtue, as the basis of moral judgment. For Hume, moral evaluations result from sympathy corrected by the general point of view. So, we have these sort of sympathetic feelings for others. We can identify with the suffering and pain of others, or we want pleasure for others. So we have these sympathetic emotions. And, I mean, obviously in practice, our sympathies are very limited, but like, we can, I guess, imagine extending sympathy to sort of all relevant beings. And, I mean, once you do that, there's no, like, why would you stop at humans, right? Like, you can see if you have a sympathetic response to human pain. If you see a human in pain and that's distressing, well, why wouldn't you similarly have sympathy for the animal, right? Yes, maybe that's a much better way of being. I certainly think Hume was probably happier than me. He probably had a better life than me, from at least from the stories that are told about him. Or at least in terms of his kind of attitude. He seems to have a very positive attitude to life. So maybe that's a much better way of being. And if that's your way of being, then obviously you should care about animals, and you should be in favour of pretty strict restrictions on how we treat animals. but of course that's not me. So yeah, I'm in a strange position. Like I agree with my views because they're my views, but I'm increasingly coming to see them as the product of a psychological constitution that makes me worse off than others. So I can't, can I promote my views to others? Maybe not. What I can do, I suppose, is like I'm expressing a certain way of life, right? A way of being in the world, and I want to be sort of sincere and coherent, at least by my own lights. I can recognise that if I were constituted differently, I would, number one, be happier, and number two, I would care about animals. And I'd probably have different moral views in other respects as well. Like, probably my inclination towards libertarianism is probably a product of this. I mean, I used to be a kind of right-wing libertarian. I'm not anymore. I've moved to the left. But, I'm still very, very libertarian. And again, like in that case, I never really cared very much about like inequality and stuff. So again, if this was, this is, it's not just like one view. But this is, with respect to animals, that's the thing that's been most controversial, and that's what I was thinking about. But probably, a whole lot of my moral views are products of this way of being. So, I can recognise that if I were constituted differently, I would be happier, and I would have different moral views. But I can't access that, right? At least not in any straightforward way. I mean, that way, that's not me, right? That way of being is not me, and I can't just kind of click my fingers and become a different person. I can't just become David Hume, right? And if I were to if I were to kind of adopt the views of the happier people, I mean, I guess I could do that, right? Like I could adopt the moral attitudes of the happier people, but just doing that is not going to make me happier. It would only make me insincere. So that's why I say I haven't changed my mind on anything. And I guess as well, it is worth noting that I suppose when I say that I would be happier if I were constituted differently. I mean, I'm not sure about that, right? I mean, this is all conditional. It's conditional on the assumption that other people's lives are good, and maybe they're not, and there are plenty of people who are very compassionate and also very miserable. I know that. So compassion alone, I guess, isn't going to do it. But it's forming those sort of social bonds, those deep friendships. That seems to be based on these sorts of emotional, on that sort of emotional structure, and that does seem to make people happy. And I suppose in some ways it's also contingent on social circumstances. If society were different, if there were more con men, if people were more selfish, then compassionate attitudes could lead to disaster. If we lived in a more sort of Hobbesian world, then the compassionate people would just be suckers. So, it's not like this is necessarily the worst way of being or anything, but it's just something I've been thinking about. I've been rethinking. Not exactly, I haven't been rethinking whether or not I endorse these views myself, but I've just been rethinking, I suppose, the whole way of being and, where my moral views come from. So I don't really have a firm conclusion to any of this, but I think that the people who were very unhappy with the position I took with respect to the animals issue are not going to be happy with my position now, but I mean, they might find this, maybe this has made a little bit of a concession to them, right? So that's where we are. Okay, that's all.